Cassidy had been quiet lately. Ever since that incident in the morgue, when they found out that Anna was innocent, she hadn't been very talkative, mostly going to her classes and silently listening to the lessons. When her classes were over, she simply went back to her dorm room, where she sat and mulled over her notes. Not class notes, investigation notes. Somehow, someway, she would have to find out who had been committing these murders. The madness had to stop. It was then that there was a knock at her door. Well, not so much a knock, more of a fervent pounding. "Cassidy!" screamed the voice on the other side. It sounded like her friend Jonathan, who she'd known well since grade school. "Cassidy, are you in there?" "What?" she called back, going over to open the door. "I'm right here. What's the matter?" When she opened the door, Jonathan was there, gasping for breath. Apparently he had run all the way there. This was troubling. "Cassidy, you won't believe it! It was Bardsley!" "Bardsley? You mean our anthropology teacher?" she asked. Jonathan nodded frantically. He was at the Burger Hut. I watched it all happen." What happened?" Cassidy frowned, not liking where this was going. As Jonathan explained what he saw, the 2 phones, the incriminating text messages, that unsettling smile on his face when he died, Cassidy was devastated. I mean, sure, Professor Bardsley had always been a little odd. He never seemed to get truly upset, always maintaining a perfectly pleasant demeanor no matter what the circumstance. But still, the Mafia? It was so hard to believe. But she knew that Jonathan would never lie to her. Not about something like this. I need to see for myself, Cassidy breathed. "What?" Jonathan cried. "You can't be serious, Cass. The body's probably still there." "I don't care," Cassidy replied. Her stomach churned a little as the words left her lips, but she ignored it. I need to find out more about this. Maybe we can find out who the other Mafia members are. Maybe—" Her voice trailed off, not sure what exactly she was planning. Would she really find anything useful there? Did she really want to see her professor's dead body? Was it even safe to go to the Burger Hut with that Morty guy there? But somehow, none of that mattered right now. I think I just need to see it to believe it, you know? Wait! Jonathan shouted after her, but it was no use. Cassidy was already gone, on her way to the Burger Hut. She couldn't stop herself. She had to know the truth. The scene at the Burger Hut was gruesome. A crowd was gathered in the middle of the room, but it wasn't hard to see what they were crowding around. There, lying on the dirty floor of the Burger Hut, was the lifeless body of Professor Bardsley, his blood pooling beneath him, and just as Jonathan had described, he was smiling. But it wasn't a normal smile. It was the smile of a killer. Even after seeing it, Cassidy found it hard to believe. It felt a lot like a dream, really. Maybe, she couldn't help but think, it wasn't really true. Her teacher hadn't been killed, and he wasn't part of the Mafia. She would wake up from this terrible nightmare and go to her anthropology class where Professor Bardsley would be teaching with that pleasant smile of his. However, as much as she didn't want to believe what she was seeing, she knew that it was just the shock speaking at this point. This was definitely real. Professor Bardsley was definitely dead. And yet, it was hard to shake that familiar and yet thoroughly unsettling sense of an otherworldly presence in the room. It was almost as if Professor Bardsley was still there. Amid the chaos, no one had noticed at what point the translucent figure had faded into the back of the room. In fact, no one had really noticed him at all. Instead, people were crowding around his body, arguing over all the deaths that had happened recently. Over his death, even. It was very surreal, and yet so very fascinating. So he just stood there, watching. After Dakota took the body away and the crowd started to disperse, Cassidy stood in silence, not sure what to do. She considered asking about the texts, wondering if they contained any clues as to the other Mafia members' identities, but she didn't really want to go anywhere near the guy who had killed her teacher, unconscious or not. Instead, she glanced around the room, hoping that somehow there would be evidence nearby. She noticed the booth where Professor Bardsley's coat and unfinished meal were sitting. Her stomach churned a little as she realized that meal would never be finished, that coat never be claimed. Looking at it thoughtfully, she noticed that some sort of liquid was seeping through the coat pocket. Cassidy raised an eyebrow, finding this a bit unusual. She moved closer for a better look, but even up close, she couldn't tell what the mysterious liquid was. "Hey, she spoke up, looking around the room. "Does anyone know what—" And then she saw him. Cassidy gasped, heart pounding in disbelief. She'd seen the body, watched Dakota carry it away in a body bag, and yet there he was, standing in the back of the Burger Hut, looking on silently at the scene before him. At first she thought she was seeing things, that it was actually someone who just happened to look similar, but then she remembered. Ghosts. There were rumors of ghosts wandering the town. Not just the innocent ghosts, but the guilty ones, too. Chantel and Susie had told her explicitly that they'd seen Lindsay's ghost at the beach just yesterday. And now, she was seeing the ghost of Professor Bardsley. She was terrified. She knew that she was seeing the ghost of a confirmed Mafia member. She didn't know if it was dangerous. Could ghosts still hurt living beings? And yet, she found herself moving toward him. She came here looking for the truth. Perhaps this was how she was going to get it. When he noticed his student approaching him, he did a double-take, as if surprised that she was able to see him. He looked like he was considering leaving, but Cassidy would have none of that, calling out to him, "Hey!" At first he was silent, but when Cassidy had stopped in front of him, staring up at him in a mixture of horror and disbelief, he knew he had to say something. "Yes?" "It really is you," Cassidy spoke in little more than a whisper. You're a ghost." A pause. And then Professor Bardsley gave a familiar, pleasant chuckle. "Don't be ridiculous. Ghosts don't exist." Cassidy raised an eyebrow. "You're dead, Professor. How do you think you're still here?" "Was there something you needed, Miss Jackson?" he asked politely, ignoring her question. Cassidy mulled over what to say. What could she say? She wanted to ask him about the chill of the night, maybe find out who the other members were, but she knew he wouldn't tell her anything useful if she asked him directly. In fact, he was unlikely to tell her anything useful at all. So instead, she decided to ask the one question that had been burning in the back of her mind ever since she found out the truth. "Why?" she breathed. "Why did you do it?" Professor Bardsley just smiled, seeming almost amused at the question. Of all things, amused! "There are a number of reasons for what happened. Mr. Greenhand, for instance, was killed to avenge Lindsay." "No, that's not what I asked," Cassidy stopped him. "I want to know why you did it. I mean, why?" There was a pause as he considered how best to answer. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me." Another pause. I suppose one way to describe it would be curiosity. Research." Cassidy was stunned by the reply. "Just research? That's why all those people had to die?" "It's more complicated than just that. You wouldn't understand," Professor Bardsley said, as if it somehow would help. It didn't help. It wasn't good enough. That's horrible," Cassidy spat. "Anna and Leo, and they were killed by abominable IFM, not us," he pointed out. "Whatever," Cassidy threw her arms in the air. "All those people who died, they were people, and you killed them just for what? Just as some kind of study? You're sick!" Before she could stop herself, Cassidy swiped at her former professor as if she could somehow beat some sense into him. Professor Bardsley moved as if to counter, to grab her by the wrist and likely reprimand her for her foolish decision, but it didn't matter. Cassidy's hand went right through him, as if he wasn't there at all. Cassidy gasped, immediately pulling back. She shivered at the sensation she felt as her arm passed through Professor Bardsley's ghostly body. It felt so cold, somehow. Or, well, chilling was a very apt description. The professor himself seemed bothered by this, brow furrowed in thought. "No," he muttered. I'm dead." After taking a moment to regain her bearings, Cassidy looked up at him, scowling. "So much for ghosts not existing, huh?" "Ghosts don't exist. It doesn't make sense," Professor Bardsley remarked, seeming genuinely troubled by this new information. "Ghosts can't exist, or... I need to study this further." "You... wait! Get back here!" Cassidy shouted as Professor Bardsley vanished in the blink of an eye. Cassidy started to panic. He said he needed to... study ghosts? But if this would be anything like his other so-called research, what exactly was he going to do? Professor Bardsley was not used to being a ghost. As soon as he said he needed to do further study, his demi-existence seemed to give way to an even more demi-existence. The world around him became a blur, and sounds were muffled. From what he could tell, it seemed Miss Jackson could no longer see him as well. Apparently he had become invisible. Was that a thing that ghosts could do? He tried not to dwell on it too much, instead thinking about what he wanted to do now. He knew he needed to do research, but how? He certainly didn't keep any books on ghosts in his personal library at home. Perhaps there would be some at the library? Yes, maybe he would try the library. As he caught hold of this thought, he wheeled himself toward the library, moving through the streets of Ifam Cove with no regard to walls or other solid objects. He didn't notice if he had passed anyone along the way, but if he had, they likely would have felt a mysterious, chilling breeze brush past them. He stopped inside the library, where the world faded back into focus around him. It was dark and empty, and he realized that the library was probably closed this late at night. At this point, though, he didn't care. He was already dead. What hold did trivial rules such as closing times have on him? He let out a breathless sigh and started on his search. Surely somewhere in the library there would be some sort of book on ghosts. It was hard to notice exactly how much time had passed, seeing as he no longer experienced such mortal sensations as hunger and fatigue, but eventually Professor Bardsley found himself in a small section of the library dedicated to the supernatural. The selection of books before him was somewhat less sophisticated than he would have liked, but desperate times called for desperate measures. He scanned the shelf for the most promising book he could find and reached to grab it. His hand went right through it. He frowned. How was he supposed to do any research like this? He thought back to the events of earlier today, before he had died. Loath as he was to recall it, ghosts had interacted with him, pelting him with snowballs and putting bacon in his hair. Both of those objects were very physical things, so surely it had to be possible for ghosts to pick up objects. He concentrated harder, trying again to pick up the book. After a few failed attempts, he finally managed to get a grip on it and pulled it off the shelf. He gave a pleased smile and carried the book over to one of the reading tables, sitting it down. He carefully flipped it open and started to read. The information in the book didn't seem to be terribly helpful, mostly just speaking hypothetically about the behaviors of ghosts and why they chose to stay in the land of the living. Professor Bardsley found this especially troubling, seeing as he didn't even remember making the decision to come back. He remembered dying and then emptiness. Maybe something happened? He couldn't quite recall. At any rate, his next clear memory after that was being in the burger hut, watching the commotion that immediately followed his death. The book spoke vaguely of having some purpose to fulfill before moving on, but Professor Bardsley couldn't think of any such purpose for himself. Maybe he just didn't want to die, or didn't want to face any punishment that may have been awaiting him in the afterlife. That seemed plausible. He moved to turn the page, but his fingers went through the paper. Oh, right. He concentrated again, then flipped the page. This was going to take some time to get used to. If only someone had written a comprehensive guide to being a ghost, it would surely be helpful right about now. He continued studying long into the night, unfortunately finding little actually practical information. Though even if the research proved fruitless, he realized, at least it was helping him to adjust to his new form. Every book he picked up, every page he turned took a little extra effort than it used to, and the repetitive nature of the task helped him get a handle on how to do it. Before long, picking up and handling solid objects started becoming easy to him, and that was definitely going to be a useful skill to have.